Eleanor wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked across her wheat fields. The summer of 1885 had been brutal in Nebraska. The sun beat down mercilessly, and her crops were struggling. 3 years had passed since her husband died, and keeping the farm running felt like swimming against a strong current. She walked back toward her small farmhouse, her boots kicking up dust with each step. The wooden porch creaked as she climbed the steps. Inside, she found the foreclosure notice still sitting on her kitchen table. The railroad company wanted her land, and they wanted it badly. Eleanor had read the letter so many times she could recite it from memory. The debt seemed impossible to pay. After buying seeds, fixing equipment, and keeping food on the table, there was barely anything left. Her savings jar, once full of coins from better days, now held only a few dollars. Eleanor often wondered how much longer she could hold on as she prepared a simple lunch of bread and water. She heard footsteps approaching her house. Through the window, she saw a tall man walking slowly up the dirt path. He wore dusty clothes and a worn hat pulled low over his face. In his arms, he carried a small boy who looked very sick. Eleanor quickly set down her bread and hurried to the door. The man stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her with tired eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from the road. "I hate to bother you, but my boy here is real sick. We've been traveling for days and I don't know where else to turn." Eleanor looked at the child in his arms. The boy's face was pale and hot with fever. His breathing was shallow, and he barely opened his eyes. Without thinking twice, Eleanor stepped forward. "Bring him inside right now," she said, opening the door wide. "Put him on the bed in there." The man hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't want to impose. We don't have money to pay you." "Money?" Eleanor shook her head. "That child needs help. Bring him in." The stranger climbed the steps and followed Eleanor into her bedroom. He gently placed the boy on her bed, and Eleanor could see how much he loved this child. His hands were gentle as he brushed the boy's hair from his forehead. "What's his name?" Eleanor asked, already moving to get cool water and clean cloths. "Tommy," the man replied. "He's 8 years old, and I'm Jack. Jack Williams." Eleanor noticed the small pause before his last name, but she was too focused on the sick child to think much about it. She dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on Tommy's forehead. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake up. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. 3 days, Jack said. "Started with a cough, then the fever came. I've been carrying him since yesterday, looking for a doctor or anyone who might help." Eleanor looked at this man called Jack. His clothes were dusty and worn, but they were well made. His hands were rough, but she noticed they were clean despite the travel. Something about him seemed different from the usual drifters who sometimes passed through. "The nearest doctor is 2 towns over," Eleanor said. "But I've nursed plenty of sick folks. Let me see what I can do." She spent the next hour tending to Tommy. She made him drink small sips of water, changed his fever-soaked clothes, and kept cool cloths on his head. Jack watched everything she did with grateful eyes. "You're very kind," he said quietly. "Any mother would do the same," Eleanor replied. She paused, realizing what she'd said. "I mean, any person would do the same." Jack nodded, understanding. "You lost children?" "My husband and I, we hoped for children, but it never happened. Then he died in an accident 3 years ago." Eleanor kept her hands busy, not wanting to see pity in Jack's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jack said simply. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." Something in his voice made Eleanor look up. She saw genuine pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from real loss, not just polite sympathy. As evening approached, Tommy's fever began to break. He opened his eyes and looked around the unfamiliar room. When he saw Eleanor, he didn't seem afraid. "Are you an angel?" he asked in a small, weak voice. Eleanor smiled, the first real smile she'd had in weeks. "No, sweetie. I'm just Eleanor. How do you feel?" "Hungry," Tommy said, and Jack let out a relieved laugh. "That's the best thing you could say," Eleanor told the boy. "I'll make you both some food." She went to her kitchen and looked at what she had. It wasn't much, but she was determined to make a good meal for her guests. She had some vegetables. From her small garden, a bit of flour and milk from her cow. She made fresh bread, a hearty vegetable soup, and poured tall glasses of cool milk. Jack tried to protest when she set the food before them. "Ma'am, this looks like it might be all you have. We can't take your food." "Nonsense," Eleanor said firmly. "I have plenty." It was a lie, but she'd go hungry before she'd let a sick child leave her table without a good meal. Tommy ate slowly, but steadily. Color began returning to his cheeks with each spoonful of soup. Jack ate gratefully, and Eleanor noticed he had good table manners. He wasn't rough or crude like some of the men who drifted through looking for work. After dinner, Eleanor prepared beds for them in her late husband's workshop. She gave them clean blankets and pillows, making sure Tommy was comfortable and warm. "Can't thank you enough," Jack said as she prepared to leave them for the night. "You've been more than kind. Tomorrow, when Tommy's stronger, we'll be on our way." "You'll do no such thing," Eleanor said. "That boy needs rest, and you both need proper food. Stay as long as you need." Jack looked surprised. "Ma'am, we couldn't impose like that. It's not an imposition, it's what neighbors do for each other. But we're strangers, not neighbors." Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe that's true, but sometimes strangers become the best friends you'll ever have." That evening, after making sure Tommy was comfortable, Jack joined Eleanor on her front porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors change. "Your husband," Jack said eventually. "What was he like?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "He was a good man, strong, hard-working, always saw the best in people. He built this farm, from nothing. Just him and his bare hands. He used to say that the land would take care of us if we took care of it. Sounds like a wise man." "He was. I just wish I was half as strong as he was. Sometimes I don't know how I'll keep this place running." Jack was quiet for a moment. "What kind of troubles are you facing?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't usually share her problems with strangers, but something about Jack made her feel safe. Maybe it was the gentle way he cared for Tommy, or the respectful way he spoke to her. "The railroad company says we owe them money," she finally said. "A lot of money. They want to foreclose on the farm." "Railroad company?" "The Midwest and Pacific Railroad. They say my husband signed papers promising to pay them, but I don't understand how. He never mentioned any debt to a railroad." Jack's expression grew serious. "Do you have the papers they sent you?" "Yes, but I don't understand all the legal talk. The banker in town says there's nothing I can do. Would you mind if I looked at them? I've seen some legal papers in my travels. Maybe I could help you understand what they're saying." Eleanor was surprised by the offer. Most drifters didn't concern themselves with other people's problems, especially complicated ones like legal documents. "You'd do that? After what you've done for Tommy and me? It's the least I can offer." As they continued talking, Eleanor found herself opening up to Jack in ways she hadn't with anyone since her husband died. He listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her life and struggles. Jack, in turn, shared stories about his travels with Tommy. He spoke about losing his wife 2 years earlier, though he didn't give many details. Eleanor could hear the pain in his voice and didn't push for more information. "It's just been Tommy and me since then," Jack said. "We've been traveling, trying to find, I don't know, peace maybe. A place where the hurt doesn't follow us everywhere." "And have you found it?" Jack looked at her in the soft evening light. "I think I might have found the beginning of it." When Tommy woke up the next morning, his fever was completely gone. He sat up in bed and asked for breakfast, which made Eleanor laugh with joy. She made pancakes and eggs using the last of her supplies without regret. Over breakfast, Tommy chattered about everything he saw on the farm. He was fascinated by the chickens, amazed by the cow, and full of questions about how everything worked. Eleanor found his curiosity infectious and started seeing her farm through fresh eyes. "Can I help with the chores?" Tommy asked. Papa always says idle hands make trouble. If you're feeling strong enough, I'd love the help, Eleanor replied. Jack offered to work as well. I can't let you feed and house us without doing something in return. Eleanor was about to protest, but then she looked around her farm. There were so many things that needed fixing, so many tasks that were too big for one person. Maybe accepting help wasn't such a bad idea. Well, she said slowly, if you really don't mind, there are a few things that need attention. Jack smiled, and Eleanor noticed it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Just point me in the right direction. As they finished breakfast, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope, for the first. 2 weeks had passed since Jack and Tommy first arrived at Eleanor's farm, and what was supposed to be a brief recovery had turned into something much more meaningful. Tommy had not only recovered completely, but was thriving in the farm environment. His laughter could be heard throughout the day as he chased chickens, helped gather eggs, and asked endless questions about everything he saw. Jack, meanwhile, had proven to be far more helpful than Eleanor ever expected. On his first day of work, she had pointed him toward some simple fence repairs, thinking it would keep him busy while she tended to more complex tasks. But when she checked on his progress that afternoon, she found him completely rebuilding a tiny section of fence that had been damaged in a storm months earlier. Jack, she called out, impressed despite herself. You didn't need to do all this. He looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. The old posts were rotted through. If I just patched it, the whole thing would come down in the next strong wind. Eleanor examined his work closely. The fence was better than it had ever been, even when her husband first built it. Jack had used techniques she'd never seen before, creating joints that would hold for decades. Where did you learn to build like this? She asked. Jack's hands stilled on his tools for just a moment. Picked up things here and there. When you're traveling, you see different ways of doing things. It was a reasonable answer, but Eleanor sensed there was more to it. She was beginning to notice that Jack often gave these vague explanations about his past, never quite lying, but never telling the whole truth either. The next day brought an even bigger surprise. Eleanor's windmill had been broken for months, leaving her without a reliable source of water for her crops. She'd been hauling water by hand from the creek, a back-breaking task that took hours each day. When Jack asked if he could take a look at it, she almost laughed. That thing's been broken since spring, she said. I've had 3 different men try to fix it, and they all said it needed parts I can't afford. Jack climbed up to examine the mechanism while Tommy watched from below, shouting encouragement to his father. Eleanor went about her morning chores, not expecting much. But around noon, she heard a familiar sound she hadn't heard in months, the steady turning of windmill blades and the creak of the water pump. She ran outside to find Jack climbing down from the windmill, his face covered with grease and dirt, but wearing a satisfied smile. How did you... Eleanor began, staring up at the turning blades in amazement. Just needed some adjustments, Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag. The gear mechanism was jammed, and one of the guide ropes had snapped. Nothing too complicated. Nothing too complicated. Eleanor had watched skilled mechanics struggle with that windmill. Yet Jack had fixed it in a few hours with nothing but basic tools and spare parts he'd somehow found around her farm. That afternoon, while Jack worked on repairing her plow, Eleanor found herself studying him more carefully. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd worked with machinery before, but not just farm equipment. The way he examined the plow's metal parts and adjusted the blade angles suggested someone with engineering knowledge. Tommy, she said quietly to the boy who was helping her hang laundry. What kind of work did your papa do before you started traveling? Tommy looked up at her with innocent eyes. Papa worked in a big building with lots of people. He had a really big desk, and sometimes important men would come talk to him. What kind of big building? I don't know. Mama used to bring me there sometimes. It had tall windows and... Oh. There were pictures of trains on the walls. Lots of pictures of trains. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Trains. Railroad. Pictures. She looked over at Jack, who was now completely absorbed in his work on the plow, his movements precise and knowledgeable. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind, but she pushed it away. Surely it was just a coincidence. The following week brought more evidence of Jack's mysterious skills. When one of Eleanor's horses developed a limp, Jack examined the animal with the thoroughness of a trained veterinarian. He diagnosed a small stone lodged in the hoof and removed it expertly, then mixed a poultice that healed the injury within days. When Eleanor's cooking stove began smoking dangerously, Jack dismantled it completely and rebuilt the flue system, improving the draw and making it safer than it had ever been. When she asked how he knew so much about stove construction, he simply said he'd helped people with similar problems during his travels. But it was the incident with the banker that truly opened Eleanor's eyes to Jack's hidden depths. Mr. Whitmore, the local banker, arrived one sweltering Thursday afternoon in his fancy carriage, dressed in his best suit despite the heat. Eleanor had been expecting this visit. She'd missed her monthly payment to the bank, and Whitmore never let such things slide. "Mrs. Hartwell," Whitmore said, removing his hat as he stepped onto her porch, "I think you know why I'm here." Eleanor nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. "I have the payment, Mr. Whitmore. Well, most of it. I just need another week to—" "I'm afraid another week won't help, Mrs. Hartwell. The railroad company has been putting pressure on the bank. They want this matter resolved quickly." Jack, who had been repairing the porch railing nearby, looked up at the mention of the railroad company. Eleanor saw something flash in his eyes. Recognition, anger, or both. "What kind of pressure?" Eleanor asked. "They're offering to buy your debt from the bank," Whitmore explained. "If you can't make full payment by next month, we'll have no choice but to sell your note to them. And once they own your debt—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what happened when the railroad company got control of a farm's debt. Foreclosure came swift and merciless. "But that's not legal," Eleanor protested. "Is it?" Whitmore shrugged uncomfortably. "It's perfectly legal, Mrs. Hartwell. The bank has the right to sell debt to recover losses." "Actually," Jack said quietly, setting down his tools and approaching them, "that depends on the original terms of the loan agreement." Both Eleanor and Whitmore turned to look at him in surprise. Whitmore's expression showed barely concealed disdain for the dusty farmhand who dared to interrupt their business discussion. "I beg your pardon?" Whitmore said coldly. Jack's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the humble, soft-spoken drifter. He stood straighter. His voice carried more authority, and his eyes had a sharp, calculating look Eleanor had never seen before. "I said it depends on the original loan agreement," Jack repeated. "If the loan was made with specific collateral terms, particularly regarding land use or mineral rights, the bank may not have the legal authority to transfer the debt without the borrower's consent." Whitmore's face flushed red. "And what would you know about banking law, Cowboy?" "I know that Nebraska banking regulations require full disclosure of any potential debt transfers at the time of the original loan," Jack replied smoothly. "I also know that railroad companies are prohibited from acquiring agricultural debt through third-party purchases in counties where they're actively seeking land for expansion." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at Jack in shock. Where had this knowledge come from? And why was Whitmore looking so uncomfortable? You seem to know a lot about banking regulations for a farm worker," Whitmore stuttered. "I've seen similar situations in my travels," Jack replied, but his tone suggested there was much more to the story. "Mrs. Hartwell, do you have copies of your original loan documents?" Eleanor nodded mutely and went inside to retrieve the papers. When she returned, Jack examined them with the intensity of a trained lawyer. His eyes moved quickly across the pages, and she saw him pause at certain sections, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Whitmore," Jack said finally, "according to these documents, Mrs. Hartwell's loan was classified as an agricultural development loan, which specifically prohibits transfer to railroad interests without written consent from both parties and approval from the State Banking Commission." Whitmore's face went pale. That is, the railroad company assured us that all regulations had been properly addressed. Did they provide documentation of state banking commission approval? Well, no, but then any attempt to transfer this debt would be illegal, Jack said firmly. I suggest you inform the railroad company that this particular property is not available for acquisition through debt purchase. Whitmore stammered some excuses and quickly climbed back into his carriage, leaving Eleanor and Jack standing alone on the porch. Jack, Eleanor said slowly, how did you know all that? For a moment, Jack looked like he might tell her the truth. His mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, he turned away from her searching gaze. Like I said, I've seen similar situations. But Eleanor wasn't satisfied with that answer anymore. That evening, after Tommy had gone to sleep, she confronted Jack directly. I need to know who you really are, she said as they sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. Jack was quiet for a long time. I'm exactly who I said I am. A man traveling with his son. No, you're not. You fix my windmill like an engineer. You knew those banking laws like a lawyer. Tommy talks about your big office and important meetings. I'm not stupid, Jack, whatever your real name is. Jack flinched at her words. Eleanor, As August faded into September, the wheat fields around Eleanor's farm began to turn golden. It should have been a time of celebration, harvest time, when all the year's hard work would finally pay off. But instead of joy, Eleanor felt a growing sense of urgency. The deadline for her farm payment was approaching, and despite all of Jack's help improving the property, she still didn't have enough money. More troubling were the changes she'd been noticing in herself. Every morning she found herself looking forward to seeing Jack smile over breakfast. Every evening their conversations on the porch seemed to last a little longer. Tommy had become like the child she'd never had, and watching Jack interact with his son filled her heart with warmth she'd forgotten was possible. But with these growing feelings came growing confusion about Jack's true identity. The man who claimed to be a simple drifter continued to display knowledge and skills that didn't match his story. Just that week, he'd helped her neighbor fix a complex problem with his grain thresher, diagnosing the mechanical issue with the precision of a trained engineer. Papa sure knows a lot about machines, Tommy had commented innocently as they walked home. Yes, he does, Eleanor replied, studying Jack's profile as he walked ahead of them. Tommy, what kind of work did your papa do in that big building you mentioned? Tommy scrunched up his face, thinking. He sat behind a really big desk and talked to lots of people. Sometimes men in fancy suits would come see him and they'd look at big papers with numbers on them. What kind of numbers? I don't know. But Mama used to say Papa was very important because he helped decide where the trains would go. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Trains. Again, everything seemed to come back to trains and railroads. She looked at Jack, who was now pointing out different birds to Tommy, completely absorbed in being a father. Could this gentle man really be connected to the railroad company that was trying to take her farm? That evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Eleanor decided to test her suspicions. Jack, she said carefully, what do you think about the railroad companies, the way they're buying up farmland? Jack's hand stilled on the piece of wood he'd been whittling for Tommy. What do you mean? Well, it seems like they have so much power. They can just decide they want someone's land, and somehow they always get it. Don't you think that's wrong? It depends, Jack said slowly. Some railroad expansion is necessary for commerce and growth, but when companies use underhanded tactics to force people off their land. His voice trailed off, and she saw his jaw clench. That's not business, that's greed. You sound like you've seen it happen before. I have, more than once. Jack set down his whittling knife and looked directly at Eleanor. The railroad business can corrupt good men, make them forget that behind every piece of property they want is a family, a life, a dream. There was such pain in his voice that Eleanor almost reached out to comfort him. But before she could, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 men rode up to Eleanor's farmhouse in the gathering dusk. They were well dressed, but had the hard look of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than charm. The leader, a tall man with cold gray eyes, dismounted and approached the porch. Mrs. Hartwell, he called out. Eleanor stood up, instinctively moving closer to Jack. Yes? My name is Davis. I represent the Midwest and Pacific Railroad. We need to discuss your property. Eleanor felt Jack tense beside her. When she glanced at him, his face had gone completely rigid, and he was staring at the lead man with an expression she couldn't quite read. I've told your company repeatedly that I'm not interested in selling, Eleanor said. Davis smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Ma'am, I don't think you understand your situation. Your debt to the bank will be transferred to our company within the week. After that, well, let's just say we'll have other options for acquiring your land. That transfer is illegal, Jack said quietly, speaking for the first time. All three men turned to look at him. Davis's eyes narrowed as he studied Jack's face in the lamplight from the house. I'm sorry. Who are you? Davis asked. A friend of Mrs. Hartwell's, Jack replied, his voice steady but cold. Well, friend, Davis sneered, this is a private business matter. I suggest you stay out of it. Jack stepped forward, and Eleanor was surprised by how intimidating he could look when he chose to be. Gone was the gentle farmhand she'd come to know. This was someone used to authority, someone accustomed to being respected and obeyed. I suggest you check your facts before making threats, Jack said. The debt transfer you're planning violates both state and federal regulations regarding railroad land acquisition. Davis's sneer faltered. You seem to know a lot about railroad law for a farm worker. I know enough to recognize when someone is trying to steal land through fraudulent means. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Davis stared hard at Jack, and Eleanor could see recognition dawning in his eyes. You know, Davis said slowly. You look familiar. Have we met before? Jack's expression didn't change. I don't believe so. Davis continued studying Jack's face. Well, regardless, Mrs. Hartwell's situation remains the same. The bank will transfer her debt and we will foreclose. Unless, of course, she'd prefer to sell now and avoid the unpleasantness. The answer is still no, Eleanor said firmly. Davis shrugged. Your choice, ma'am. But I should mention that accidents have a way of happening to farms that resist progress. Equipment breaks down, crops get damaged, sometimes even buildings catch fire. Terrible shame when things like that happen. The threat was barely veiled, and Eleanor felt fear creep up her spine. But before she could respond, Jack stepped forward. Mr. Davis, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I want you to listen very carefully. Mrs. Hartwell is under my protection now. If anything happens to her, her property or her livelihood, I will hold you personally responsible. And trust me when I say you don't want that kind of trouble. Something in Jack's tone made all three men shift uncomfortably. Davis opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. This isn't over, Davis said finally. No, Jack agreed. It isn't. After the men rode away, Eleanor turned to Jack with wide eyes. What just happened? Who are you that you can talk to railroad men like that? Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness where the riders had disappeared. Eleanor, there are things about my past that I need to tell you, but not tonight. Tonight I need to make sure you and Tommy are safe. Safe from what? Those men weren't just making empty threats. The railroad business can be ruthless when people stand in their way. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Jack, I'm scared. Not just of them, but of not knowing who you really are. How can I trust you when you won't tell me the truth? Jack turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she could see the struggle in his eyes. You want the truth? The truth is that I've spent the last 2 years running from who I used to be. The truth is that the man I was before would have been everything you hate about the railroad business. The truth is that I came here broken and lost, and you've given me the first real peace I've known since my wife died. But who were you? What did you do? I made decisions that hurt people like you. Good people who just wanted to keep their farms and live their lives in peace. And when I realized what I'd become, I walked away from everything and started traveling with Tommy, trying to find some way to make amends. Eleanor stared at him. Are you saying you worked for the railroad? I'm saying that the man I used to be is part of the problem you're facing now, but the man I am today, the man I want to be, will do everything in his power to protect you." Before Eleanor could respond, Tommy appeared in the doorway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Papa?" I heard voices. "Is everything okay?" Jack's expression immediately softened as he looked at his son. "Everything's fine, Tommy. Just some business visitors. Go back to bed." As Tommy disappeared back inside, Eleanor realized how much this little boy had come to mean to her. The thought of anything happening to him or to Jack filled her with protective anger. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we gather information. Tomorrow I'm going to town to send some telegrams and ask some questions. There are people who owe me favors, people who might be able to help us understand exactly what Davis and his company are planning." "People who owe you favors?" "Jack, what kind of life did you lead before you came here?" Jack looked at her for a long moment. "The kind that's about to become very useful for protecting the life I want now." The next morning, Jack rode into town with a list of telegraph addresses that he'd written from memory. Eleanor watched him go with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She was beginning to understand that Jack's mysterious past might be the key to saving her farm, but she was also afraid of what she might learn about the man she was falling in love with. While Jack was in town, Eleanor spent the day working in her fields and thinking about everything that had happened. Tommy helped her harvest vegetables, from her garden chattering about his papa and how smart he was. "Papa says we might stay here forever," Tommy announced as he picked tomatoes. "Would you like that, Eleanor?" Eleanor's heart skipped. Did he really say that? Uh-huh. He said this might be the place where we stop traveling, and the next morning dawned gray and cloudy, matching Eleanor's troubled mood. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about what Jack would reveal. As she prepared breakfast, she noticed that Tommy seemed unusually quiet, picking at his eggs instead of eating with his usual appetite. "Tommy, are you feeling all right?" she asked, sitting down beside him. The boy looked up at her with worried eyes. "Eleanor, are you and Papa going to have a fight?" Eleanor was surprised by the question. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" "Papa was awake all night. I heard him walking around, and this morning he looked really sad, like when Mama died." Eleanor's heart clenched. She reached over and smoothed Tommy's hair. "Sometimes grown-ups have to talk about difficult things, but that doesn't mean anyone's going to get hurt or go away." "Promise?" Eleanor looked across the kitchen to where Jack stood by the window, staring out at the fields. His shoulders were tense, and she could see the weight of whatever he was carrying. "I promise we'll figure everything out," she said to Tommy, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. After breakfast, Jack asked Tommy to spend the morning at the Morrison farm, playing with Pete's children. Tommy was reluctant to leave, sensing something important was about to happen, but Jack insisted. "I'll come get you this afternoon," Jack promised his son, "and then we'll all have dinner together and decide what we're going to do next." After Tommy left, Jack and Eleanor sat on the front porch. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Jack took a deep breath. "My real name is Jackson Theodore Blackwood III, he began. "And I'm the president and majority shareholder of the Midwest and Pacific Railroad Company." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her. She gripped the arms of her chair, staring at Jack in shock. You're the railroad man? The one who's been trying to take my farm?" "No," Jack said quickly. "That is, yes, I own the company. But no, I haven't been trying to take your farm. Eleanor, I had no idea what was happening here until I saw those foreclosure papers you showed me." Eleanor stood up abruptly, backing away from him. "You're lying. You have to be lying." "I'm not lying. Please let me explain." But Eleanor was already shaking her head, tears of anger and betrayal burning in her eyes. "All this time you've been lying to me. You've been in my house, eating my food, sleeping under my roof, and you're the very person who's trying to destroy my life." "Eleanor, please, how could you do this to me? How could you let me trust you, let me care about you when you knew what your company was doing?" Jack stood up too, his hands extended toward her in a pleading gesture. "Because I didn't know." "Eleanor, you have to believe me. 2 years ago, after my wife Caroline died, I had what doctors called a nervous breakdown. I couldn't function, couldn't make decisions, couldn't even get out of bed some days. Tommy was the only thing that kept me going. Eleanor wiped angry tears from her cheeks. So what, you just abandoned your business? I left it in the hands of my business partners while I tried to recover. I thought they would run things honestly, the way Caroline and I had always insisted. We had rules: no forced foreclosures, no buying debt to steal land, no intimidation tactics. The railroad was supposed to be a tool for bringing commerce to communities, not destroying them. Then how do you explain what's happening now? Jack's face darkened with anger, but Eleanor could see it wasn't directed at her. My partners saw an opportunity to make quick profits while I was absent. They started using practices that Caroline and I had forbidden: fraudulent debt purchases, forged documents, intimidation, everything we'd spent years avoiding. And you had no idea? None. Tommy and I left Chicago right after Caroline's funeral. We've been traveling ever since, staying in small towns, trying to heal. I haven't had any contact with the business in over a year. Eleanor paced across the porch, her mind reeling. So when you saw my foreclosure papers, you knew they were from your own company? Not at first. But when I examined them closely, I recognized the signatures. My business partners had been forging my name on legal documents. Your name? What do you mean? Jack pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I wrote to the company's legal department yesterday, demanding copies of all foreclosure orders issued in this county. This is what they sent back. Eleanor took the paper and unfolded it. Her hands trembled as she read the official foreclosure notice bearing her name. At the bottom was a signature that read, Jackson T. Blackwood III, President. They forged your signature on my foreclosure? On yours, and dozens of others. Eleanor, they've been using my absence to steal land all across Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. And they've been doing it in my name. Eleanor sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. I don't understand. If you own the company, why can't you just stop them? Jack sat down across from her, his expression pained. Because legally I gave them power of attorney when I left Chicago. They can make business decisions in my name as long as I'm declared mentally unfit to run the company. Are you? Mentally unfit, I mean? The doctors in Chicago said I was suffering from severe depression and anxiety. They recommended I take time away from business responsibilities until I recovered. Eleanor looked at this man she thought she knew, seeing him with completely new eyes. So you've been hiding from your own company? I've been hiding from the man I used to be. Eleanor, before Caroline died, I was consumed with business. I worked 18-hour days, made deals worth millions of dollars, commanded hundreds of employees. But I was so focused on success that I lost sight of what success was supposed to serve, which was building something that would make life better for people like you. Caroline always said that a railroad should bring opportunity to communities, not take it away. She made me promise that we'd never become the kind of company that destroys families for profit. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, trying to process everything she'd learned. Caroline was your wife? Jack nodded. She died in a carriage accident 2 years ago. She was coming home from visiting her sister when the horse got spooked. The carriage overturned. His voice broke slightly. If I hadn't been working late that night, I would have been with her. Maybe I could have prevented it. Oh, Jack. Despite her anger and confusion, Eleanor felt her heart ache for his loss. After she died, I couldn't bear to be in Chicago anymore. Everything there reminded me of her, and every business decision I made felt empty without her guidance. So I took Tommy and left, intending to travel until I figured out how to live without her. And you ended up here. I ended up here. And for the first time since Caroline died, I started to feel human again. Watching you work your farm, seeing your strength and determination, taking care of Tommy when he was sick, you reminded me what real strength looks like. Eleanor stood up and walked to the porch railing, staring out at her fields. So what happens now? Do you go back to Chicago and fire your business partners? It's not that simple. They've been building legal cases against me, documenting my mental instability, gathering evidence that I'm unfit to run the company. If I try to return now and take control, they'll have me declared incompetent. But you're not incompetent. Anyone can see that. Can they? Eleanor, I've been hiding on farms and in small towns for 2 years, calling myself by a false name, unable to face my own responsibilities. A court might very well agree that I'm not fit to run a major corporation. Eleanor turned back to face him. Unless you had proof that they were the ones acting illegally. Exactly. But gathering that proof would mean exposing myself, returning to Chicago and risking everything. And even then, it might not work. What about all the families who are losing their farms? Don't you owe them something? Jack's expression grew pained. I owe them everything. This is all happening because of my weakness, my inability to handle grief like a responsible adult. These families are losing their homes because I ran away from my duties. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse and self-blame there. Slowly, her anger began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Jack, you lost your wife. You were grieving. That's not weakness. That's being human. Tell that to the Johnson family or the Millers or any of the other families who'll be homeless because of decisions made in my name. Eleanor walked back to her chair and sat down. What would Caroline have wanted you to do? Jack looked up at her in surprise. What? Your wife? If she were here right now, what would she tell you to do? Jack was quiet for a long moment. She'd tell me to stop feeling sorry for myself and start fixing the problem. She'd say that the only way to honor her memory is to make sure our company becomes what we always dreamed it could be. Then maybe that's what you should do. Eleanor, if I try to fight this and lose, I'll have nothing left to offer you. No money, no power, no way to protect your farm or anyone else's. Eleanor reached across and took his hand. Jack, I fell in love with a man who fixed my windmill and played with Tommy and sat on this porch talking about his dreams. I didn't fall in love with a railroad baron or a wealthy businessman. If you're willing to fight for what's right, then you already have everything I need you to be. Jack stared at her in amazement. You still love me? Even after everything I've told you? The train whistle echoed across the Nebraska plains as Jack, Eleanor, and Tommy stood on the platform in Omaha. Jack wore a proper suit for the first time in 2 years, looking every inch the successful businessman he once was. But Eleanor could see the nervousness in his eyes as he prepared to face his past. Are you sure you want to come with me? Jack asked Eleanor for the 10th time. Chicago could be dangerous. My business partners won't be happy to see me, and they certainly won't. Welcome you. Eleanor adjusted Tommy's collar and smiled at Jack. We're in this together now. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't lose your courage and run away again. Jack managed a weak smile. Fair point. The journey to Chicago took 18 hours, and during that time, Jack told Eleanor and Tommy stories about the city they were about to enter. He described the tall buildings, the busy streets, and the magnificent office building where the Midwest and Pacific Railroad had its headquarters. Will I get to see your big desk, Papa? Tommy asked excitedly. I hope so, son. If everything goes according to plan, you'll see much more than that. When they arrived in Chicago, Eleanor was overwhelmed by the size and noise of the city. She had never seen so many people in one place or buildings that stretched so high into the sky. Jack hailed a carriage to take them to a hotel, and Eleanor noticed how naturally he slipped back into the mannerisms of a wealthy businessman. The Blackwood Hotel, Jack told the driver. You own a hotel too? Eleanor asked. Jack looked embarrassed. My family has investments in several businesses. The railroad is just the largest one. At the hotel, Eleanor began to understand just how wealthy Jack really was. The manager himself came out to greet them, practically bowing as he welcomed Mr. Blackwood back to Chicago. Their suite was larger than Eleanor's entire farmhouse, with furniture that probably cost more than she made in a year. That evening, as Tommy slept in one of the suite's bedrooms, Jack and Eleanor sat by the window overlooking the city lights. Are you having second thoughts? Jack asked quietly. About all of this, about me? Eleanor took his hand. The only second thoughts I'm having are about whether you'll still want a simple farm life after being back in all this luxury. Jack squeezed her fingers. Eleanor, these buildings, this wealth, none of it means anything without someone to share it with. You and Tommy are my life now. Everything else is just things. The next morning, Jack's first stop was his lawyer's office. Robert Chen had been the Blackwood family attorney for 20 years, and his face showed pure relief when Jack walked through the door. Jackson, thank God you're alive. I've been so worried, especially after the reports your partners have been spreading about your mental state. What kind of reports? Eleanor asked. Chen looked uncomfortable. They've been building a case that Jackson is suffering from severe mental illness, that he's been seen acting erratically in various towns using false names, living as a vagrant. They've hired investigators to document his unconventional behavior. Jack's jaw tightened. Unconventional behavior like helping farmers and living honestly? Like abandoning your responsibilities and disappearing for 2 years? Chen corrected, gently. Jackson, I understand you were grieving, but from a legal standpoint, your partners have a strong case for having you declared incompetent. Eleanor felt her heart sink. So there's nothing we can do? I didn't say that. Chen opened a thick file on his desk. I've been conducting my own investigation into your partner's activities. What I've found is very interesting. Over the next hour, Chen showed them evidence of systematic fraud throughout the railroad company. Forged signatures, falsified debt records, intimidation tactics, and illegal land seizures. All documented, in meticulous detail. The question is, Chen said, are you prepared to fight this publicly? It will mean exposing everything. Their crimes, your absence, the company's illegal activities. The newspapers will have a field day. Jack looked at Eleanor. What do you think? I think sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. That afternoon, Jack walked into the headquarters of the Midwest and Pacific Railroad for the first time in 2 years. Eleanor waited in the lobby while he took the elevator to the executive floor. She could only imagine what he was feeling as he returned to the world he had once ruled. Jack's business partners, William Hoffman and Charles Drake, were meeting in the conference room when Jack walked in unannounced. Their shock was visible and immediate. Jackson, Hoffman stammered, rising from his chair. We weren't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't, Jack said calmly, taking his seat at the head of the long table. Gentlemen, I believe we need to discuss the future of this company. For the next 2 hours, Jack confronted his partners with evidence of their illegal activities. He demanded they halt all foreclosure proceedings immediately and return all illegally seized properties to their rightful owners. Drake, a thin man with cold eyes, laughed harshly. Jackson, you've been gone for 2 years, living like a homeless person and using false names. Do you really think anyone will take your word over ours? They might, Jack said, when they see the documentation of every illegal transaction you've made in my name. Hoffman leaned forward. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Jack smiled and placed a thick envelope on the table. Actually, I have quite a lot of proof, including testimony from your former secretary about how you learned to forge my signature. The eye color drained from both men's faces. Eleanor, waiting downstairs, heard raised voices but couldn't make out the words. She knew this confrontation would determine not just the fate of her farm, but the future of hundreds of families. 2 hours. Later, Jack emerged from the elevator looking exhausted but victorious. It's done, he told Eleanor simply. What's done? They've agreed to resign from the company immediately. All foreclosure proceedings will be halted, and every piece of property that was illegally seized will be returned to its owners. They'll also pay compensation to families who lost money because of their fraud. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. Just like that? They just agreed? Jack's smile was grim. They agreed when I showed them the choice was between resignation and prison. They chose resignation. Over the next month, Jack worked tirelessly to undo the damage his partners had caused. He personally visited families who had lost their farms, returning their properties and offering compensation for their losses. He fired every employee who had participated in the fraudulent schemes and hired new people who shared his vision of ethical business practices. Eleanor and Tommy stayed in Chicago during this time, and Eleanor got to see a different side of Jack. The brilliant businessman who could command a room full of executives, negotiate complex deals, and make decisions that affected thousands of lives. But every evening, he came back to their hotel suite exhausted, seeking the simple comfort of family dinner and Tommy's bedtime stories. "Do you miss it?" Eleanor asked one evening as they walked along Lake Michigan. The power, the excitement of running such a huge company. Jack considered the question seriously. "I miss feeling useful. I miss knowing that my decisions were helping people. But the power, the constant pressure? No, I don't miss that at all. What do you want now?" Jack stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want to marry you. I want to adopt Tommy legally if you'll have him as your son. I want to build a life where business serves family, not the other way around." Eleanor's heart soared. "And the railroad, the company?" "I'm promoting my assistant Robert Miller to president. He's a good man with a good heart, and he understands the vision Caroline and I had for the company. I'll remain chairman of the board, but I won't be involved in day-to-day operations." "Where will we live?" Jack smiled. "Wherever you want. But I was hoping you might say Nebraska, on a certain wheat farm that needs a lot of work." Eleanor laughed and kissed him right there on the Chicago waterfront. "I think that can be arranged." They were married 3 weeks later in Eleanor's small church back in Nebraska. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by all the farming families whose homes Jack had helped save. Pete Morrison gave Eleanor away, and Tommy served as ring bearer, beaming with pride at finally having a complete family again. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a simple act of kindness, feeding 2 hungry strangers, had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with their neighbors, Tommy pulled on Eleanor's wedding dress. "Mama Eleanor," he said, using the name they'd decided he would call her. "Are we really going to live on the farm forever?" Eleanor looked around at the gathering of friends, then at Jack, who was deep in conversation with one of the farmers about new irrigation techniques. "Forever is a long time, sweetheart, but yes, I think this is where we belong." 5 years later, Eleanor stood in that same spot watching her husband teach their 4-year-old daughter, Caroline, how to plant seeds in the rich Nebraska soil. The farm had prospered under Jack's business knowledge and Eleanor's farming wisdom. They had expanded the property, improved the irrigation systems, and even started a small agricultural school for other farmers in the area. Tommy, now 13, was already showing signs of inheriting his father's